In the first quarter of 2026, the Russian army, one of the largest military forces on the planet, belonging to a country of over 140 million people, a country with nuclear weapons, a country that spent decades projecting itself as a global superpower, captured an amount of Ukrainian territory roughly equal to the size of Fresno, California. That is not a metaphor. That is not rhetorical exaggeration. That is the actual military output of Russia's offensive operations across an entire 3-month period, stated plainly by former Navy SEAL Team 6 squadron leader Chuck Farrer. Thus far in Q1, the Russians have captured the sum total square kilometer footage of Fresno, California, so it's not a win. In January 2022, Putin's forces occupied 27% of Ukraine. He probably had the champagne on ice. In Q1 of 2026, they took Fresno. That is the trajectory of this war. And once you understand what is driving that collapse, the casualty math, the recruitment crisis, the armor losses, the quality of the soldiers being sent to the front, you will understand why experts who have spent decades analyzing warfare are now saying something that would have seemed impossible 4 years ago. Russia is not just losing ground in Ukraine, Russia is losing this war, and the implosion is accelerating. I'm Flash America. Stay with me, because the data behind this story is extraordinary, and every layer of it is worse for the Kremlin than the one before. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story that no amount of Kremlin propaganda can spin away. The Institute for the Study of War published a report on March 31, 2026, analyzing Russian advance rates over the past 2 years. The findings are stark. Russian forces advanced at an average of 11.06 square kilometers per day in the first 3 months of 2025. By the first 3 months of 2026, that figure had dropped to 5.5 square kilometers per day. The advance rate cut in half in a single year. Breaking it down month by month makes it even clearer. January 2026 saw Russian forces gain approximately 319 square kilometers, 123 square miles. That is already a mediocre number for an army that is supposed to be on a sustained offensive. Then February happened. Russia gained 123 square kilometers in February, 47 square miles. That was the smallest Russian territorial advance since April 2024, and it was also the month, confirmed by ISW conflict analyst George Barros in an interview with Business Insider, when Ukraine actually gained more territory than it lost. Barros stated, "The Ukrainians are gaining more ground. Notably, in February, the Ukrainians liberated more territory in the theater than the Russians seized. The last time we had seen Ukrainian forces make more ground than the Russian forces seized was in 2023. This is new." For the first time in years, Ukraine was outpacing Russia territorially. And then March arrived. In March 2026, Russia seized a mere 23 square kilometers, 9 square miles, while also losing ground in other areas. For the first time in approximately 2.5 years, Russia's army recorded essentially no net territorial gains on the front lines of Ukraine. The Russian army has not just slowed down, it has effectively stopped. To fully appreciate how extraordinary this is, you need to understand what Russia has been doing with those soldiers for the past 2.5 years. The Center for Strategic and International Studies analyzed Russia's push for the city of Pokrovsk, one of its most significant and sustained offensive campaigns. Pokrovsk was supposed to fall within weeks. Instead, from February 2024 to January 2026, Russian forces moved approximately 50 kilometers, 31 miles, from Avdiivka to the outskirts of Pokrovsk. That works out to an average advance rate of about 70 meters per day. 70 meters per day. That is slower than the Allied advance during the Battle of the Somme in World War I, over 100 years ago. That comparison is not included for shock value. It is included because it is accurate and because it illustrates how completely Russia's offensive capacity has degraded. Russia's other campaigns, at Kupiansk, at Chasiv Yar, have been even slower, with the Kremlin sometimes requiring multiple months to capture a single small settlement or a contested strip of cratered land. At these rates, capturing the 4 eastern regions that Putin originally went to war to take would require years. And every year this war continues, it costs Russia more, in money, in men, in equipment, in international standing, and in the credibility of the president who launched it. Dr. Jason Smart, an international political consultant who has been tracking this war closely, noted that when you combine the casualty rate with the territorial progress, Russia is currently losing approximately 316 soldiers per square kilometer in the Donetsk region. 316 soldiers per square kilometer, for essentially no movement. That is not a military campaign. That is a grinding attrition that Russia is losing. Now let's talk about the human cost, because this is where the situation moves from bad to potentially catastrophic for the Kremlin. March 2026 alone saw over 35,300 Russian casualties, killed and wounded combined. That is a 29% increase over February's numbers. In the first quarter of 2026 as a whole, Russia reportedly lost over 100,000 men. 100,000 casualties in 3 months. Chuck Farrer put Russia's annual casualty rate in precise terms. The truth is Russia loses 360,000 casualties a year, essentially 1,000 people a day. That's 2 battalions of forces, depending on whether you have large or small. It could be 3 battalions. 2 to 3 battalions, every single day, gone. No army can sustain that indefinitely. Even an army belonging to a country of 140 million people cannot simply manufacture soldiers out of nothing and feed them into a kill zone at that rate forever. The numbers are already starting to show the strain. Moscow is having an increasingly difficult time finding recruits to replace the men it is losing, and the measures it has resorted to in order to fill those gaps tell you everything about how desperate the situation has become. Russia is intimidating ethnic minorities into signing up. It is recruiting mercenaries from Africa. It brought in troops from North Korea. It has sent convicted rapists and murderers to the front lines. It has deployed people with long-term illnesses and serious medical conditions. It is pressuring universities and businesses to push their students and employees toward military service, essentially begging civilian institutions to do the recruiting work that the military cannot accomplish on its own. None of it is working at the scale required, and with Ukraine planning to inflict up to 50,000 casualties on Russian forces per month, there is no recruitment pipeline in existence that could make those numbers sustainable. Farrer is direct about the consequence. These numbers will not cover Russia's losses, and they certainly will not allow the Kremlin to build up the forces it needs for the kind of large-scale military operations, like a summer offensive, that Moscow keeps announcing. But the numbers are only part of the problem, because it is not just how many soldiers Russia is losing, it is who those soldiers are and who is replacing them. At the beginning of the war in 2022, Russia's army was largely made up of career soldiers, men who had dedicated their professional lives to the military, men with years of combat experience, trained in weapon systems and tactics, capable of staying composed under fire because they had been in those situations before. Men who, whatever one might think of their mission, were genuinely committed to it. That army took Ukraine's territory at a rapid rate in the opening weeks because it was a real military force operating with professional standards. That army is mostly gone now, killed, wounded, or burned out over 4 years of warfare that Russia never expected to last this long. What has replaced it is a fundamentally different kind of force. Conscripts who do not want to be there, convicts given a choice between prison and the front lines, sick men who should not be anywhere near a battlefield, people lured by financial incentives, large sign-up bonuses, and monthly salaries, who are fighting for a paycheck, not for conviction. People who were pressured, blackmailed, or otherwise coerced into signing enlistment papers they had no real choice in. These are not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They are bodies, and they know it. Chuck Farrer described the practical consequence of this collapse in training and quality. Russia has entered an incredibly dangerous and irrecoverable military phenomenon where they don't have time to train their soldiers, so the civilians that arrive on the Ukrainian battlefield, they lack fundamental skills that are necessary to survive in ground combat. He cited footage of up to 20 Russian soldiers standing together in a group in a forest, clustered, exposed, stationary, before a Ukrainian thermal drone located and destroyed them. He noted that new Russian recruits often arrive at the front with no idea what to do or where to go. Some wander off and get lost. These are not anecdotes. They are symptoms of a force that has passed the point where it can adequately train and integrate new soldiers before sending them into combat. Russia is running a conveyor belt. Bring them in, push them to the front, watch them die, bring in more. And the conveyor belt is getting slower because the supply of bodies willing to step onto it is dwindling. The result, predictably, is collapsing morale. Morale is one of those factors that does not show up cleanly in statistics but determines everything in a long war. Soldiers who believe in what they are doing, who trust their commanders, who have confidence in the people beside them, those soldiers fight effectively even against difficult odds. They hold positions, they execute plans, they make sacrifices. Soldiers who are disillusioned, frightened, and primarily concerned with their own survival do none of those things. They look for exits. They surrender. They desert. And according to Jason Smart, that is exactly what is increasingly happening, with more and more Russian troops deserting because they simply do not want to remain in frontline kill zones any longer than they are forced to. The collapse is not confined to the battlefield. It is spreading across Russia itself. Smart reported that 35 different Russian regions are now struggling financially because of the enormous sums they are being forced to spend on recruitment bonuses and one-time sign-up incentives. Regional officials who should be investing in schools, hospitals, and infrastructure are instead burning their limited budgets trying to convince unwilling civilians to go fight a war. The money that was supposed to build Russia's future is being spent on recruitment drives that barely move the needle. And the Russian people are noticing. The Institute for the Study of War tracked Russian state-run polls, the Kremlin's own polling apparatus, and found that Putin's approval rating declined in 6 consecutive weeks, from March 2nd through April 12, 2026, dropping from 72.9% down to 66.7%. General trust in Putin has fallen. Popularity of his ruling party, United Russia, has declined. Polls show that more than 60% of Russians have a negative opinion of the current political situation in their country, and the vast majority of the population now wants the war to end. When the Kremlin's own media mouthpieces are publishing data showing declining trust in Putin and majority opposition to his war, it is a sign that the information environment inside Russia is no longer fully controllable. When 6 out of 10 Russians tell pollsters, even state-run pollsters, that they view the political situation negatively, it is a sign that the gap between what the regime says and what people experience in their daily lives has grown too large to paper over with propaganda. More and more Russian families have a direct personal connection to the war now. A son killed, a husband wounded, a brother deployed to a front line he may not return from. That personal connection changes how people receive official narratives. It becomes very hard to believe that the war is going well when someone in your family has paid the price of it. Now let's talk about the hardware, because behind the manpower crisis, there is an equipment crisis that is equally serious. Russia has lost more than 11,000 tanks since the invasion began. Chuck Farrer put that number into context that makes it genuinely staggering. 11,000 tanks is 5 times the total number of tanks fielded by all European NATO partners combined. Russia has not just lost armor in this war, it has lost an amount of armor that would constitute a world-historic military catastrophe for almost any other nation on Earth. Russia's Soviet-era stockpiles have provided a buffer. T-72 and T-80 variants continue to be pulled from storage, refurbished, and sent to Ukraine. But even those enormous Cold War stockpiles are being drawn down, and the quality of what is being deployed reflects the depth of the crisis. Russia is increasingly relying on the T-62, a tank that entered service in the early 1960s, a tank that Cold War leaders like John F. Kennedy were briefed on during its introduction into Soviet service. That is how old it is. That is what one of the world's supposed leading military powers is reduced to fielding on an active battlefield in 2026. And without sufficient armor, Russia's tactical approach on the front lines has been reduced to something that military analysts describe in almost clinical terms, but which, in practice, is simply the mass expenditure of human lives. Small groups of 15 to 20 soldiers, no armor support, minimal coordination, sent directly into contested kill zones where Ukrainian drone operators, artillery crews, snipers, and other specialists are waiting for them. Farrer's description is unsparing. Suicide squads, thrown into the meat grinder, marching into positions where they can be picked off as if shooting fish in a barrel. This is not a military strategy. It is what militaries resort to when they have run out of real strategies. When they have no armor to lead breakthroughs, no air superiority to suppress defenses, no well-trained infantry to execute maneuver warfare. When all you have left is bodies, you spend bodies, and you accept the catastrophic exchange rate that comes with it. There is one more dimension to this collapse that deserves to be stated clearly because it extends far beyond the front lines in Ukraine. The United Kingdom's intelligence services have assessed that 97% of Russia's military capacity is currently committed to Ukraine. 97%. That means Russia has approximately nothing left over to deal with any other threat anywhere else on its enormous territory. Farr raised the specific implication that Moscow's officials are reportedly increasingly concerned about: China. Despite a surface-level alignment between Beijing and Moscow, China has long harbored territorial interests in Russia's Far East, regions that Russia, in its current state, would be essentially powerless to defend if China chose to act on them. The country that invaded Ukraine, expecting a quick, decisive victory over a smaller neighbor, has stretched itself to the point where it cannot protect its own borders against a potential threat from a much larger and more powerful neighbor. That is how far this war has taken Russia from where Putin thought it would go. In late March 2022, Putin controlled 27% of Ukraine and appeared to be weeks away from potentially capturing Kyiv itself. In the first quarter of 2026, his army took Fresno. His troops are being sent to the front with no proper training and no armor support. His recruitment apparatus is begging universities and businesses to push people toward enlistment. His regional governments are going broke on sign-up bonuses. His approval rating is declining in his own state-run polls. His army has lost 5 times the total European NATO tank fleet, and 97% of his military is pinned down in a country he expected to fold in days. The tide, as Farr put it when summarizing the broader trajectory, I think inevitably Ukraine is going to make progress pushing through them. He pointed to precedents Ukraine has already established, pushing Russian forces entirely out of Kherson in 2024, forcing them back across the Dnieper River, driving them out of the Sumy Oblast around Kharkiv. The same factors that enabled those successes, the brittleness of Russia's command structure, the corruption and ineptitude of its officer corps, the shortage of military resources beyond basic rifle ammunition, are getting worse, not better. This is the trajectory, not the trajectory that Russian state media shows, not the trajectory that Kremlin officials discuss publicly. The actual trajectory, measured in square kilometers captured per day, in casualties per square kilometer gained, in approval ratings declining in 6 consecutive weeks, in T-62 tanks pulled from Cold War storage because there is nothing better left to send. In 2022, the narrative that surrounded Russia's military was one of inevitable crushing power, the largest army in Europe, overwhelming numbers of tanks and artillery, a nuclear arsenal, a leadership that had shown in Chechnya and Syria that it was willing to use force without restraint. That narrative has been tested against 4 years of actual warfare and found to be exactly what Ukraine's commanders always suspected it was: a facade, a mythology built on Soviet-era equipment, Soviet-era thinking, and a political structure that prioritized loyalty over competence at every level of the chain of command. The soldiers being sent to die in 70-meter-per-day advances towards cities that were supposed to fall in weeks are not dying in pursuit of an inevitable Russian victory. They are dying in service of a war that has already cost Russia more than any honest accounting of the original objectives could justify, and produced in the first quarter of 2026 territorial gains roughly equal to the size of Fresno, California. The champagne Putin had on ice in March 2022 has long since gone flat. What has replaced it is a war he cannot win, cannot stop, and cannot admit is destroying the country he claims to be defending. I'm Flash America. If this gave you the real picture of where Russia's military actually stands right now, not the propaganda, but the numbers, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. I cover this war every week with the depth and detail it deserves. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Russia can sustain this pace through a summer offensive? Or is the collapse accelerating faster than even the analysts are projecting? I'll see you in the next one.